Welcome to the deep dive. You know how we do it. We take your articles, your research, your notes, and we distill the absolute core of what you need to know to be truly well informed. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that, well, it feels like it's changing by the minute, the escalating Iran Israel conflict as of June 22, 2025. Our mission here is to cut through all the noise and get right to the most important facts, maybe some surprising insights, and of course, all the global implications.
Yeah, it's incredibly sensitive and complex situation. Our goal throughout this deep dive is really just to offer an impartial analysis. We're focusing squarely on understanding the factual developments and, their far-reaching consequences, strictly as they're presented in the material you've shared. No taking sides here.
Right, exactly. So let's dive straight in. Before we maybe dissect the wider fallout, could you just quickly lay out the timeline for us? Like, what were those critical moments that truly ratcheted up the tensions to where we are today?
Certainly. The significant intensification point you'll find mentioned in the sources is October 2024. That's when Israel reportedly launched preemptive strikes on Iranian military and nuclear sites. And what's striking here isn't just the military action itself, maybe, but this strategic shift it seems to represent. Israel's willingness to cross this long-held threshold with these preemptive strikes, especially targeting missile bases and air defenses. Well, it suggests a new doctrine. It's seemed to prioritize immediate nuclear constraint, reportedly because Iran was getting close to a nuclear threshold. That fundamentally alters the calculus for everyone else in the region. Iran did retaliate, with missile strikes, but the material highlights that their effectiveness was quite limited. Iran's military capabilities seem to have been significantly weakened. That's attributed to what's described as Israel's superior intelligence and military power. So you have damaged air defenses, compromised missile production.
Okay, and then the U.S. involvement you mentioned, that sounds pretty significant. Was this just a clear statement of, like, strategic alignment with Israel, or were there other objectives, maybe? Things related to global stability or non-proliferation?
Well, the reports do indicate the United States conducted strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. That certainly deepened the escalation. While the direct motivations are always complex, right?
Yep.
The U.S. has consistently voiced concern over nuclear proliferation. So this action, it really underscores its strategic interests in, containing potential nuclear threats in the region.
And looking at these actions, these strikes, through the lens of international law, what kind of ripples did that create? What were the sort of big concerns that popped up immediately?
Yeah, what's fascinating there is the immediate concern about violations of international law and the UN Charter. That foundational document outlining principles for international relations designed specifically to prevent this kind of widespread conflict. There's a pervasive fear right from the start that this whole thing could spiral out of control, that it could draw in other regional, maybe even global powers, leading to a much, much broader war.
Wow. Okay, so the conflict itself is intense, but then those ripples start spreading beyond the immediate borders. What does that mean for global markets? Let's talk economics first.
Right. The most immediate, the most noticeable impact you'll see mentioned was on the oil markets. After those initial strikes, there was a reported 7% jump in oil prices.
Yeah.
Quite significant. And this isn't just about, pain at the pump for consumers. It's more systemic than that. It's a shock that filters into manufacturing costs, supply chains, ultimately consumer spending. It creates this ripple effect that could really dampen global economic growth, maybe exacerbate existing inflationary pressures too,
Sure.
especially if the escalation continues or if, key trade routes get affected.
Right. Okay. So beyond that immediate oil price shock, if this conflict drags on, what does that mean for broader inflation for global supply chains?
Well, while the initial sort of inflationary impacts might seem somewhat contained, a prolonged conflict that could severely disrupt trade and supply chains.
Particularly within the Middle East, which is, it's critical crossroads for global commerce.
Right.
This would undoubtedly affect global markets for a whole range of goods and commodities, way beyond just oil. And given how interconnected everything is today, global markets, is it possible that a conflict like this could trigger something systemic, a collapse? Or are there enough fail-safes, maybe, to just cause a big slowdown rather than a full-blown recession?
That's the big question, isn't it? If tensions escalate further, if they truly draw in other regional or global powers, the global economy could face a really significant adverse shock. Our sources indicate this has the potential to lead to recessions, yeah. Especially in markets that are already a bit vulnerable or maybe highly reliant on those disrupted trade routes. It's a systemic risk. It's not something that can be easily contained if it really gets going.
Okay, so we've touched on the economic tremors, but what about the geopolitical landscape, the ground shifting beneath our feet there? How does a conflict like this redraw the maps of power, especially between the major global players?
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex. The conflict poses a high risk of drawing in other Middle Eastern actors.
Hmm.
We're talking about groups like Hezbollah, other Iranian proxies, these armed organizations operating with Iran's support. Its influence, you find them in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Gaza. Their involvement would significantly increase the risk of a much wider regional war. It could spread the conflict way beyond the direct borders of just Iran and Israel.
That sounds, yeah, terrifying, frankly. And with the U.S. already involved, how does this tension play out among other big global powers like uh, China or Russia?
Well, the involvement of the United States, particularly in striking those Iranian nuclear sites, it signals a kind of a deepening of superpower engagement. And this could significantly strain relations with other global powers. China, Russia, for instance. They might be inclined to align more closely with Iran, maybe due to their own strategic interests or, geopolitical rivalries. This could lead to some complex global power shifts, potentially more polarized international system.
And it sounds like this is challenging some really fundamental international principles, too. How is the conflict impacting the very frameworks of global diplomacy? Is it weakening them?
It absolutely is, yeah. The conflict has certainly drawn criticism for violating international norms. Iran, for instance, has claimed Israel's actions are an aggression against its sovereignty. Now, such accusations, regardless of their specific basis in law, they can potentially undermine the very foundations of global diplomatic frameworks, those principles of international law. It just makes it harder to address future crises through the established channels.
Yeah, definitely. And beyond all the high-level policy and economic stuff, there's a deeply personal side, isn't there? The human cost. What kind of toll are we seeing there?
Tragically, yes. The human cost is significant. Our sources report that Iranian missile attacks have reportedly killed at least 24 people in Israel. And that includes women and children, which prompted immediate and widespread calls for civilian protection. There are just pervasive fears of further civilian harm, obviously in both nations, but also across neighboring regions, if this conflict escalates further.
And how does this conflict impact global stability beyond just the immediate fighting? Are there broader security implications we should be aware of?
It's broadly seen as a significant threat to global stability, yes. The perception of Iran as, well, the term used is state sponsor of terrorism. That amplifies fears. Fears that if the regime feels cornered or significantly weakened, it could lead to maybe increased asymmetric activities or even traditional terrorist activities worldwide. That's a major concern.
And in an age where information is so crucial, so immediate, how is it being managed or controlled during this conflict? Are there challenges in just getting a clear picture of what's actually happening on the ground?
Absolutely, and this is a really critical point.
Oh.
There are significant concerns about transparency, about the ability to verify military actions. Our sources note that Israel has reportedly implemented censorship of foreign media covering the conflict. Now, this isn't just inconvenient for journalists. It underscores a critical new front in modern conflicts, the battle for narrative control. For the global community, for you listening, it means our understanding of the truth is increasingly filtered. That makes informed international response much more challenging and potentially prone to manipulation.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly now to the strategic and military side of things. What has all this meant for Iran's nuclear program? Have the strikes ended that threat, or is it more complicated?
Well, Israel's strikes have, it seems, damaged Iran's nuclear capabilities. The sources suggest this has effectively delayed its potential to develop nuclear weapons. However, and this is a big however, this action carries a significant counter risk. It could actually push Iran to accelerate its program, maybe in secret, driven by a perceived need for deterrence now more than ever. Or it might compel it to seek more direct support from allies, potentially leading to an even more clandestine, dangerous situation that's much harder to monitor.
That's almost more worrying in a way, isn't it? So, looking just at the two nations directly, Iran and Israel, how would you describe the current military balance between them right now?
There's a clear military imbalance. Israel's military and intelligence superiority seems evident from the reports. Iran's air defenses, its missile bases, they've been significantly degraded. Now, while this imbalance might embolden Israel, it can also provoke more desperate responses from Iran. We're talking about things like asymmetric warfare, unconventional tactics used by a weaker force against a stronger one, often through non-state actors or proxies. And that kind of warfare can be extremely difficult to predict and counter.
So putting it all together then, given everything we've discussed, what's the ultimate, the overarching risk here? What could truly be those irreversible consequences that the sources warn about?
I think the core risk is really an uncontrollable escalation. The involvement of the U.S. is key. And the very real possibility of other global powers being drawn in, that significantly increases the risk of a much broader conflict. The irreversible consequences our sources refer to, I mean, that could entail a permanent reshaping of regional alliances, maybe a new unchecked arms race, massive civilian displacement,
Yeah.
and just a prolonged period of global instability that could undermine decades of diplomatic efforts. It's serious.
So what does this all mean? I mean, wow. We've covered everything from those initial preemptive strikes and their economic reverberations to the shifting geopolitical sands and that devastating human cost. This Iran-Israel conflict, it truly has global repercussions. They extend into, well, pretty much every corner. It's definitely a lot to take in, but understanding these complex interconnections, that's key to being truly well-informed, right?
Exactly. And just to recap briefly, the key impact categories we've really dug into are profound economic disruption, oil price spikes, supply chain issues, significant geopolitical realignment, that deepening of superpower engagement, grave humanitarian concerns because of the civilian casualties, and major strategic military shifts, thinking
Yeah.
about the nuclear program and that military imbalance. Knowledge, like we always say, is most valuable when you understand it in this kind of broad, interconnected context.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So thinking about everything we've just unpacked, what stands out to you from this deep dive?
That's a good question to leave the listener with. Maybe this. Given that clear military imbalance between Israel and Iran, and the potential for Iran maybe feeling cornered to resort to asymmetric warfare or seek deeper support from its allies, what are the most critical factors for the global community, for all of us, to consider in trying to contain a conflict that sources say already has irreversible consequences? It's worth pondering maybe, how do you prevent the next escalation? Or how can the international community possibly foster stability when the very rules of engagement seem to be shifting under our feet? Lots to think about.